This episode is brought to you by SS&C Mineralware. Are you managing mineral assets and feeling overwhelmed? Unsure if you're getting paid what you're owed? SS&C Mineralware is here to simplify the management of your minerals, royalties, and non-operated working interests. Mineralware's out-of-the-box features give you the tools you need to visualize and keep track of all of your assets in one place. Mineralware lets you know in seconds where your interests are, what's active, what acreage is open for lease, and if you're getting paid what you're owed. With Mineralware, you can even automate your revenue and JIB processing and eliminate tedious manual data entry, allowing you to focus on more pressing issues. Thousands of mineral owners rely on Mineralware to keep their mineral management simple, automatic, and all in one place. Take control of your mineral assets today with SS&C Mineralware. To see a demo, you can visit their website at www.mineralware.com. That's mineralware.com.
Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. In this episode, we're going to cover how to organize your mineral legacy during the holidays and have those conversations with your heirs so that, the surprise factor can get taken out of that inheritance equation. Many mineral and royalty owners, Justin, the first time that they learned that they inherited these types of assets was when they get a call from a landman. I know that was the case for you as well.
Yeah, you nailed it, Matt. It's all too common. You can organize the documents, you can have them together the best that you can, but if you aren't having the conversations with your heirs to know that it's there, you're really missing a critical piece of the puzzle. And Matt, we talk a lot about documents, but sometimes we forget about those conversations and to really mention how important they are to have those conversations. And at the holiday time, you're already together, and so it's a great time to pass along that context. And in our experience, Matt, it can save somebody a heck of a lot of confusion when they get that inheritance, because at least they have some idea and we're pointed in the right direction.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And this is a follow-on to a couple of different episodes. So in episode 274, we talked about smart estate document storage, and we talked about ways to organize these types of documents. And then I had a free estate document storage checklist. So that lists your basically your essential documents and then the way that you go about organizing those. And so we'll link to that in the show notes. So if you haven't listened to that episode, definitely listen to that, because we're not going to dive into the details of how you should organize these or the specific documents you should have. Instead, what we're going to talk about is the bigger picture and having those conversations with loved ones. This time of year, sometimes it's good. And it's a stressful time as well. You have a lot going on, but then when you're with family, everybody's together. This is kind of maybe one time per year where you have all your kids together, and it might be a great time to have those conversations as part of that estate planning process so that when the inevitable happens and they do inherit these assets that you've earmarked for them, that they're not surprised by it, that they're, know what to do. And so having those conversations about some of the resources and where to find this information and what you own, in case maybe it's not obvious, maybe they didn't know that there are mineral rights out there that maybe they're not producing and you haven't talked about it because you're not receiving income or it really hasn't been top of mind. But now's the time to potentially let them know so that, they're not getting that surprise phone call from the landman letting them know that they have inherited these types of assets and they want to lease them from your kids or whatever, and they're just trying to figure out, what does that mean? What do we do? And so you want to prevent that situation, because that surprise factor, while it's a nice surprise, of course, it also sets them and puts them on their back foot, and they really don't know where to begin. And you can give them tips and share what you've learned so that you can prevent them from having to go through the school of hard knocks maybe that you've had to go through, because it's certainly not uncommon for those things to just sort of fall by the wayside and not get passed down, not get deeded over. So now's the time to go through and create that inventory of your assets. And so, Justin, let's talk about that, kind of organization factor and creating that inventory and sort of what this time, is conducive for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a lot of the time you've got your family around, you've got a slower pace of things. A lot of people are in a retrospective mode. They're thinking about the past year and how it's gone. And it just is a kind of a natural time to bring that out and have those conversations. And Matt, there's so many things that can be saved from having these conversations, whether it's a chance to structure the minerals in a way that everybody wins more, whether it's avoiding possible issues with your estate or more legal costs or more hoops to jump through. There are so many benefits to having these conversations. And Matt, what are some of the things that you hear most commonly? I would say that we hear about problems created from this constantly. I would say a large majority of the problems that people have are because they don't either have context, they didn't know what it was, they don't know where it came from. What are some of the top stories that stand out in your mind?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing is that it creates extra work for your heirs. And obviously you want to set your family up, set your kids up for success. I had a conversation with a fellow NARO member, that's National Association of Royalty Owners, and she shared that it took her 18 months to get a handle on what she and her siblings had inherited from their father. And that's extra time that she had to spend going through. She said that there were a stack of boxes, to the ceiling, basically in a closet. And they discovered this and had to figure out what it all was. And thankfully, some of it was organized, it sounded like. But even still, just trying to figure out, making heads or tails of what those documents mean, how they related to property that they may have inherited. And if those conversations hadn't happened up front, then it could be a total surprise. And so ultimately it's that, that time period. And, obviously every family's, the dynamics are different. And so use your judgment. Obviously you have to figure out what you're comfortable with, but that kind of relaxed environment during the holidays, hopefully kind of that warm feeling. And like Justin said, that, looking back and reflective nature of the holidays, thinking about times, in the past that you've spent with your family and, the good times and things like that. And, kind of perhaps diffuses those types of conversations, and that emotional closeness can help you have an honest and productive conversation about your inheritance plans and, what your wishes are. And you don't have to, if you're not comfortable at that point, I think you don't have to get into the details about who's going to get exactly what, but just having the conversation of, hey, our family owns minerals and royalties. I want to let you know that you all are going to inherit them. And so I want to let you know where you can find information about that. And then, you can leave the details in your estate plan, in your will, in the trust documents, which you don't have to go through line by line at this point, but it's just at least giving them a heads up that they are going to inherit these interests. And, here are the things you need to know about it. Here's the resources that I found helpful, if it's the National Association of Royalty Owners, if it's this podcast, whatever it is, to say, hey, this is where you can go to learn more about this when the time comes. But just so you know, here's where you can find this inventory of the minerals and royalties, and here are the documents where they're located. And, just let them know, so, okay, when that time comes, here's where they need to go to find that information to then, execute your will and your wishes and make sure that, that they're the good stewards of those assets in the future that you hope that they'll be, and really setting them up for success by having those conversations is the first step.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. And really even setting the stage for people to understand that this is a certain property type or an asset class that maybe not very common for folks, is something, missing context that a lot of people don't have. I know when I inherited minerals, I had to learn about how property works. There's so much context that even without giving those specifics, Matt, you can tell them where they can find the info, what this is, why it's a bit different, and why they need to learn about it or might have to learn about it at some point. And creating that list, Matt, and gathering the right documents can be a bit tricky for mineral owners. And that's something that if you're going to be putting this together, you've kind of got to get an education yourself of what do I need to be keeping for this? Most people try to keep everything that they can, but there are some documents that are more important than others. Deeds, leases, things that are property ownership documents. Maybe they're historical. That'll let them know what the chain of title was. But most importantly, the deeds and the things that they're going to need to get ownership changed over whenever it's time for them to do so.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, if you don't have an idea of those documents you should be keeping, go back to our episode 274, download that free checklist, and you'll find more information on where to get started there. And then the other step that's really important, like I mentioned earlier, is to create an inventory of all of your gas, oil and gas interests. And that's all the minerals, royalties, if you have non-operated working interest, whether they're producing or not, the interest that you have in those, whether it's a fraction, the decimal or the number of net acres, if you have that from an oil and gas lease that you've, or the chain of title, if you're very much on top of that and know exactly how many net acres you own. That is all very helpful for your heirs because they're going to start from zero, not really know a lot of times the context. And so having a description, as well, hey, this was great Uncle Joe's, property, and he gave it to us and, and Uncle Jack or whatever. And so then you can say like, here's how this thing passed down over time, and you can get a handle for, maybe your cousins are going to go through the same situation, and you all can work together so that you have the power of interest and more net interest in that property, and you can use that power to negotiate better terms for leases and things like that. So there's oftentimes where I'll hear of family members like cousins working together to get the best outcome when it comes to a negotiation, for example. So the big thing is disorganization will cause more work and more stress for your heirs. And, like I mentioned, that anecdotal story of my conversation with the narrow member, the research out there shows that nearly 60% of Americans don't know where all their assets are located. And the executors spend 16 months average settling estates, with much of that time simply locating and valuing assets. So we want to take that locating assets step and shortcut that for them, and so that you can hand them, for your heirs, the list of the assets, where they're located, as much information as basically in one spot in a spreadsheet, ideally, or written down. If you're not into that, having that on a single document that you could share with them. A table of here are the states and counties where they're located, and the legal descriptions and what they are. Their minerals, their royalties. They're not producing, but here's how many net acres, whether it's leased or not, and then. Again, all that tied into where to find those documents related to the property. And again, ultimately, if you don't do this, it's a difficult conversation, and we'll fully, want to recognize that sometimes having these discussions about finances, growing up, a lot of us, that wasn't something you talked about, right? And so you don't want to, that said, you don't want to not have a basic conversation to at least inform them that they are going to be inheriting these types of assets and where to find that information. Again, if you're uncomfortable talking about the value or the numbers and things like that, then this maybe, don't do that, but just at least let them know where it is, where to find the information, how it's going to be passed down. And then, the next step, Justin, is that when you have this plan, you need to execute part of the plan. And what I mean by that is, we talked about in episode 311 about probate and marketable title and some of the different alternatives to that, like going through and deeding things into a trust or funding a trust. And then also an LLC is another mechanism you could potentially use to prevent having to go through probate for these types of assets, which can save your heirs a lot of time and money. And so, this is also the time to have those conversations with your estate planning attorney if you haven't recently. Just to make sure that everything is set up, for example, that if you're going to use a trust, that everything has been deeded over to the trust, and the trust, in other words, has been funded. Because if you don't do that, they're still going to have to go through probate, because just having a trust document doesn't set it up so that those assets are owned by the trust. So that's an important step as well. But Justin, you want to talk about, some of those other things that are important to do during this time period? If you're just if somebody's just getting started from scratch, right? They don't have this information yet. What do we need to do? What kind of steps should we be taking right now?
So, Matt, like you said, making that inventory is really your step one. And then with that inventory, you can start to collect your documents. Maybe that's the lease where you got that interest. Maybe you actually have a deed for that property. But collecting those, having those, filing those away. And then the estate plan, like you said, Matt, we hear all too often scenarios where people forgot to fund the trust. So maybe you got with an estate attorney, you had a trust created, but nothing was ever funded into the trust. Well, that can create problems. And so there's also times to think about what might be left to be done, and you can communicate that to your heirs, communicate that to your spouse, but also changes, Matt. So let's say that you funded the trust, but you found out about a new property a couple of years ago, and you realize, hey, I haven't funded that into the trust. Those would be good things to take a look at now, good things to make a list of or start working on and try to get complete. And then, Matt, there's some other conversations that you can have with your heirs. So there's some common things that we hear a lot that people aren't aware of when it comes to minerals. And these are conversations that you could certainly have. One of them that comes to mind, Matt, is that this is pre-tax income. That's something that, if you have to learn that the hard way, it could be really painful. And then there's a conversation about how you've managed the minerals. How large is this interest? Should they find an attorney? Who is your attorney? Is the interest small enough that you should, express that and let them know that, hey, this is not going to be a very large amount of money. So you need to be careful about what you do with it and do it correctly because attorneys are expensive and so on and so forth. Matt, there's a ton of things that go into this. And even if they store it in the back of their mind, that could be very useful information later in life when they do have to deal with this. Because another thing we see, Matt, is it's often not at the top of the mind when it's not your money, but when it becomes your check, it changes a bit on how important it is to you.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, the concept of trust, I know that may be foreign for a lot of us. It's not just a tool for the rich and famous. It is something that you can use. It's a good, important part of many estate plans. And again, talk with your attorney to have a conversation about what makes sense for you. But, from a trust standpoint, to your point, if you have everything in there, especially if they're particularly small interests, to your point, Justin, as these assets get subdivided and smaller, at some point they become so small that it becomes, cost prohibitive to go through probate to even get it transferred into your name. So, for example, if it's a non-producing, minerals in, the middle of nowhere, there's not drilling going on now, but you want to preserve that asset. It's got some family, legacy tied to it. The way to best handle that would be, talking with your estate attorney to figure out ways you can avoid having that asset having to go through probate, especially if you have marketable title now. Because if you have 4 grandkids and you're going to give them to your grandkids, or 4 kids, whatever the situation is, going to get subdivided into 4, they're going to have to go through this process, potentially down the road if you don't have things set up, and that's going to be 1/4 of the size of the interest now that where it is for you that they're going to own, and for them to have to go through, if they, if their heirs inherit this and they have to go through probate, it's going to be a conversation of, well, do we even need to do that, because it's worth like less than the cost of going through probate. So let's just let it sit there and, we'll just leave it because it's not worth it. So that's why potentially, putting them in a trust and having your heirs as, trustees and having that as an entire, leaving it in its entirety may make financial sense. There's like a trade-off there, I think, in terms of the cost and having to go through that. So I know from another narrow member having a conversation, a listener of the show that's written in a couple of times, David, he's mentioned that he's inherited a bunch of different interests across different counties, and he's going through and doing probate himself, not hiring an attorney just because they're so small, it'd be so cost prohibitive to do that. But he wants to maintain ownership of those and manage them for the next generation. So he's going to get it squared away and then, hopefully set it up in, trust or LLC so that his kids don't have to go through that same process. But, that's a real consideration for those small interests. And, any information you have, I think going back to that inventory concept, any information you have, that can be a very long document. It should be a long document that has lots of information there. Here, this is what type of interest it is. Here's how much we own. Here's where to find the files. They're in a safe deposit box at First Bank and Trust over here, or, they're in this old filing cabinet in the basement, or they're in OneDrive, and here's the password and how you can get into that to find the electronic copies of everything. That is important to have, because it's a great first step to have that inventory, but then the next step is, okay, now where do we find the information related to these assets?
You said it, Matt, and you brought up a really good point with the probate there. When you have minerals in another state, if you have to go through ancillary probate, that cost can be very expensive if you're working with attorneys. And so that's something that you certainly want to try to avoid that and have conversations specifically with your estate attorney about how those could be handled and how you can prepare for that. Matt, that's something we hear about all too often when folks are trying to figure out what they need to do. And telling somebody that they have to go do probate can be a bit scary, and it can be costly if you're working with an attorney to do that.
Yeah, it really can. Let's dive into, okay, so let's say that you've gotten everything organized at this point. You have your inventory, you have your documents stored and organized, and you documented where everything is located, and you need to have that difficult conversation with family. The way that I would approach that, and I know that it can be difficult to have conversations about the end of your life, right? So that can be an emotional conversation. A lot of times, your kids don't want to talk about that because they don't want to have to deal with that eventual reality. But that, again, that holiday gathering time could be a natural opportunity for those conversations when family members, have had a couple of glasses of eggnog, they're relaxed, everybody's together, sharing your wishes and just having an open conversation and asking about their wishes as well related to this. Hey, do you, that's the other thing is, have you talked about who's going to be your executor? Is it something you're, maybe you have an oldest child that, could be in that role who's mature and willing to take that on and, just identifying who that person is, because that could be important to identify in your estate plan as well. One tip that I've read is that again, if you start the conversation gently by explaining your motivation for organizing these documents, and then rather immediately diving into the specifics, right? Rather than, okay, here's this property in Reeves County, and this is what you need to know about it. It's like, well, say, hey, I've been recently working on organizing our mineral files, and I want to make sure you know where everything is if anything ever happens to me, so that you're framing it as a, more of a preparation step, it's rather than kind of the morbid reality of things. And again, just, you want to share your concerns. Hey, I just want to make sure that you don't have to go through what I went through when I inherited these, because I had to spend 18 months going through a stack of boxes in Grandpa's closet to figure out what, we had inherited. And it was a lot of effort, and it took me time and money. And I want to prevent you from having to go through that same pain. And so again, if you just sort of mention the challenges that you faced and just say, hey, I've just recently updated my estate plan, and that's why I wanted to talk about this, and just give them some context, in other words, and that can help diffuse that situation. And then, if you're at the point where you're ready to share, some practical information that they can know immediately, like the filing system, hey, here's where the files are located. Here's how I've organized everything. The most important thing, here's this asset inventory. Here's where you can find that. And, which maybe if you have assets that have sentimental value that you'd like to keep in the family, let them know about that, put that in your will, obviously. Or if there's strategic value, if you've learned something about, hey, there's potential that there's going to be some drilling here in the next, 10 or 20 years. This is a good area. It just hasn't moved there yet. So, this would be one worth holding on to. Things like that are useful to provide context. If your kids haven't had that education so far in terms of you taking them to narrow events or things like that, which I know a lot of our members do as well, Justin, where they've taken their kids or grandkids to an event just to, spend time together. It's a great time to spend as a family, but then also to, share that learning. And so that they're prepared when they do inherit these assets and are the stewards going forward, that they can hit the ground running and they know what to do.
You said it, man. And, if it's going to be another 20 years, another 30 years, we all hope to live as long as we can. But showing them somewhere like Narrow and where they can learn this information or connect with the people who can help them is a really great way to expose them to it. And maybe they choose not to drink the information at the time, but at least they know where to go get it when they need it. And Matt, there's some other things too that are worth talking about that may be a lot more fun than your, estate plan and your end of life plans. And a good way to kind of segue into this could be talking about genealogical research. What is the family history? Where did these come from? In my case, that was something my family was very proud of, was a success that my ancestor had. And so, it can be a fun way to talk about it, to talk about where this came from, to set the stage into why it has sentimental value. And then to segue into some of those more difficult conversations. Yeah,
that's a great point. And I know that we did this during COVID, right? That's a time period when we had, not a lot going on. We were together, we were at home. And so that was certainly something that we did as a family, and my wife did for her side of the family, and I updated ours as well. And so Ancestry.com, if you don't have an account there, you can go and start to do that research. And, again, that's something you could give access to your kids. So if you've done that genealogical research, that could be part of that estate plan and that, asset you hand down to the next generation, so to speak. So, all the work that you've done there, make sure it's not lost, because that can relate to the chain of title, like Justin mentioned. If this was inherited from, a great grandparent or something like that, and, it's been in the family a long time, you can, help your heirs understand that. And that can be an important thing, especially if there's sentimental value, if there's, legacy on a family ranch or a farm that these originated from. So that's, that's another, I guess, piece of the puzzle, so to speak. And so I think, at the end of the day, the practical steps to take this holiday season, those good intentions we always have to, I'll eventually have that conversation, take concrete action. I challenge you to, if you've been meaning to have those conversations with your heirs, with your kids, to do that and to, block out the time and set the stage for it. Maybe it's, everybody's staying at your house and, over a cup of coffee in the morning, everybody's sitting around and kind of relax before all the craziness and the holiday activities begin, or after, the celebrations conclude with, you're sitting by the fire or whatever. You can have those in a safe space and explain that, and then, walk them through all the things we've talked about today. But again, I think, or if you're not together, don't fret, but do not, I would say, not do this, so to speak. Don't just hope for the best, that they'll figure it out, because in that difficult time when they're having to go through, settling your estate and then having the extra stress and pressure of having to maybe negotiate the lease at that same time because they just found out that they inherited these properties, or because what's going to happen is they're going to also get purchase offers, right? So when the vultures see those deeds get filed, the personal representative's deed in the county courthouse, because they're transferring the ownership of those minerals, per your estate plans, and then they're going to get hit for sure with offers to purchase those interests. And if they're not prepared for that or don't know what they own, that can set them up for perhaps getting taken advantage of. So you don't want that to happen. You want to make sure that they make the most of that opportunity you've given them through that inheritance. And again, I think if you find that you need some tips or some refreshers on going through and doing the estate planning and the different assets or different organization types, go through and listen to episode 311, where we talked about probate and inherited minerals and some of those different options that are out there. And then if you are a member of the National Association of Royalty Owners, there's also a great webinar that was recorded recently by two of our board members that talked about preparing your mineral legacy, and some very detailed and practical guidance that can be that you can watch that video. And so if you are a Narrow member, we'll link to the members section. And so that'll be behind the member paywall, so to speak. So you have to log into your Narrow account and then go to the recorded webinar section and then click on that link. But definitely take advantage of that. And if you aren't a Narrow member and you're wanting to take time to learn about all this stuff, I would highly encourage you to become a member. You can use code MRPodcast for $25 off an introductory membership. So that brings it down to $50 for your first year. So there's really no excuse to not dive in and take advantage of all the useful education opportunities that are out there through Narrow. We have in-person events, monthly webinars, and definitely make sure you're tied into that as well. So, Justin, any last parting thoughts, from your standpoint? The
one thing I'd like to say, Matt, is it's not enough to just tell your heirs never sell the minerals. That is the number one thing we hear in the industry, and it's not the same world as it was 50 years ago, and it's not enough just to leave them with that information.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you do have wishes that you want them to hold on to it, obviously that's the time to communicate that. But that blanket advice is not helpful, because then they're conflicted if they do ever need to have to sell them to, have a pressing financial need like medical bills or something. And, you don't want to hamstring them, potentially if that would help them get through that tough time. But certainly set them up for success, whatever that looks like for you, and your particular wishes, and how you're going to manage that inheritance. But if you haven't had those conversations, to at least give your heirs a heads up. Now is a good time, as good a time as any, right? It's no time like the present. And then again, if you're not organized, now's the time to also get organized to make sure that your heirs will thank you for the hours of frustration that you've helped them avoid, and the thousands of dollars in unnecessary expenses that you've prevented them from having to spend. So on that note, that wraps up this episode. Hope you all have a wonderful holidays, and we will see you in the next episode. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.